I remember the sound before anything else, that dull crack that split the room open on the night of my 18th birthday as my father's hand met my cheek while every relative who had come to celebrate froze in stunned silence. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I simply tasted the metallic shock on my tongue, while the living room lights hummed above us and the guests stared at the floor, pretending they had not seen what they had clearly witnessed. My mother held her wine glass so tightly the stem trembled, yet she said nothing. Not a single plea, not even my name spoken softly as if I were someone worth defending. Tyler stood near the staircase with a smug tilt in his posture and muttered, "Just leave already," as though he had been waiting his entire life for this moment to unfold. My father, breathing hard and swaying slightly from the cheap beer he had consumed during dinner, grabbed my backpack from the couch, shook it once for effect, then marched toward the hallway with a glare that seemed to burn through the walls themselves. He yanked open my bedroom door, rummaged through drawers, grabbed whatever he could reach, and shoved everything into an old suitcase that still carried faded airport tags from a trip we never took. When he dragged it across the floor, the wheels screeched against the tiles like a warning only I was meant to hear. He stormed past our silent relatives, pushed open the front door, and stepped into the cold autumn rain that had begun to fall in steady, relentless sheets. I followed because there was nothing else to do, and every pair of eyes in that living room pressed against my back, reminding me that I had never truly belonged in that house, not even on the night when most families offer encouragement and hope. The rain soaked my hair and streaked my mascara as my father hurled the suitcase down the concrete steps, letting it land with a heavy thud beside the oil-stained driveway that led to his aging garage. He pointed toward the dark street beyond the yard and shouted, "Go live on the damn streets. You are 18. You are not our problem anymore," while lightning flickered in the distance and cast brief, jagged shadows across his furious face. My mother stood behind him, framed by the doorway, her blouse pressed, her posture rigid, her silence louder than any insult he had ever thrown at me. Tyler laughed under his breath as though this were entertainment and not the unraveling of an entire childhood that had already been hanging by loose threads. I clutched my jacket, trembling from more than the cold, knowing there was no apology coming, no change of heart, no final moment of kindness before the door closed forever. When the door slammed shut behind them, the sound cracked through the rain like a final sentence handed down without trial, leaving me alone on the porch with my father's, anger still echoing in my ears. I bent to lift the suitcase, but the soaked fabric clung to the ground and forced me to drag it inch by inch toward the sidewalk where the streetlights buzzed against the restless wind. Cars passed without slowing, drivers glancing for a moment at the drenched girl with the swollen cheek before turning their attention back to their warm, dry destinations. I kept moving because standing still felt too much like giving up, and I had spent my entire life being told I was nothing. I reached the end of the driveway and looked back once, hoping against reason that someone, anyone, might open the door and call my name, with even a fragment of regret. But the house remained dark, except for the dim glow of the kitchen window where my mother silently rinsed plates as though nothing unusual had taken place. The weight of the suitcase pulled at my shoulder, while the cold seeped through my jeans, and I wondered how quickly a life can fall apart when the people who raised you decide you no longer deserve a place under their roof. I walked toward the edge of the neighborhood, guided only by the harsh white light of street lamps that flickered each time the rain surged. Each step felt heavier than the one before, not because of the soaked clothes or the sting in my cheek, but because I could not shake the realization that they had waited for this moment, the chance to cast me out the instant the law allowed them to. 18 meant freedom for most people, but for me, it meant exile and the beginning of a new kind of loneliness that settled in my chest like a cold stone. Yet beneath the sorrow, something else stirred, a faint, steady pulse that whispered, "This is not the end. This is the break in the storm you never knew you needed." I lifted my chin, wiped the rain from my eyes, and kept walking until the house behind me became only a distant shape, swallowed by the night. I paused beneath a flickering streetlight and listened to the rain for a long moment, letting the cold air numb the heat of betrayal still burning along my skin. Every memory of my childhood rushed back, the shouting, the slammed doors, the quiet dinners where I pretended not to exist, and I realized I had never been wanted, only tolerated until the day they felt brave enough to discard me. I drew a slow breath, steadied my shaking hands, and whispered to the empty road that this was not where my story ended. They believed they had thrown out a powerless girl with no future, but the truth lived quietly in my pocket in the form of a signed contract worth $18 million that none of them had ever bothered to ask about. And that truth would become my new beginning today. From the outside, the Hale family fit neatly into every expectation a small Ohio town held for what a respectable, hard-working household should look like, and for most of my childhood, people believed without question that we were exactly that. Neighbors waved at my father as he backed trucks out of the garage. Customers chatted warmly with him about engines and carburetors, and the smell of motor oil drifting through our driveway made people think of honest labor and a man providing for his family. My mother, with her pressed blouses and carefully curled hair, volunteered at school bake sales and kept a polite smile ready for every passerby who complimented her on her dedication. Tyler played baseball with a loud, enthusiastic crowd of parents cheering him on, and everyone told him he was destined for greatness because he looked like my father and carried himself with the unearned confidence of a boy who had never once been told he was anything less than exceptional. They thought my family was warm and united, a picture of simple American stability anchored by tradition, routine, and mutual love. But inside our home, the truth lived in the shadows between the slammed doors, the long stretches of tense silence, and the sharp comments aimed at me whenever I dared to step out of line. My father was not a man of patient words or gentle redirection. He was a man of quick temper and quicker assumptions, and he wielded his voice like a weapon meant to keep everyone in place, especially me. He shouted often and loudly, and the entire house felt permanently on edge, as though holding its breath for the next eruption. My mother played peacekeeper only when it suited the image she wanted to project to those outside our walls, but behind closed doors, she used her silence with surgical precision. Her disapproval delivered not with raised volume, but with cold, withdrawn stillness that left me feeling smaller than the furniture she dusted with meticulous care. Theirs was a partnership built on appearances and self-preservation, not love, and certainly not understanding. I learned early that there were two versions of every day, the one we performed for the world and the one we lived when no one else was watching. People often told me how lucky I was to have a father with such a strong work ethic and a mother who seemed so involved in her children, but none of them saw the way my father's eyes dimmed with disappointment whenever I spoke too softly or too slowly, or the way my mother grimaced at me as though every quiet misstep echoed through her perfectly constructed reputation. They adored Tyler, endlessly bragging about his smallest achievements as if he were carving his name into history itself. If he hit a baseball once, they told everyone he had the makings of a pro. If he brought home a B on a test, my mother displayed it proudly on the refrigerator as if he had been accepted into an Ivy League school. He basked in their admiration, bragging to his friends that he was the future of the Hale family business and joking that I would grow up and work for him someday. They laughed each time as if the prediction was already carved in stone. For me, there were no refrigerator-worthy grades or celebratory cheers after school events. No one cared when I read entire textbooks on my own or quietly fixed our glitching family computer using skills no one realized I had taught myself. When relatives visited, my mother introduced Tyler with a flourish, but introduced me with a sigh, calling me her quiet one, in a tone that suggested the word meant problem or burden rather than personality trait. I became the shadow in every family photo positioned at the edge with forced smiles while they huddled in the center, glowing with the certainty that they belonged. Whenever disagreements erupted, which they often did, it was always blamed on me. If Tyler yelled first, I was told I should not have provoked him. If my father kicked a chair across the kitchen over something trivial, he accused me of being the reason the household felt so chaotic because I carried too much tension like a storm cloud that followed the family around. My mother would whisper, "Do not embarrass this family," each time I flinched at loud noises or tried to explain why something hurt. Shame became my second skin, and silence the language I learned best. The neighbors sometimes heard yelling, but they assumed it was typical family conflict, the kind that could be laughed off the next day, because from their windows they saw my father waving kindly, and my mother hosting summer barbecues, and Tyler bragging about his latest game. No one imagined what it felt like inside when my father slammed a door hard enough to shake the hallway, or when my mother refused to speak to me for days after a minor mistake, because she insisted I had embarrassed her in front of someone whose name I barely remembered. People called us normal, and for a long time I tried to believe them because believing otherwise meant facing the loneliness I did not yet have words for. The truth was that I lived in a home where approval was given only to those who mirrored my parents' expectations, and where my existence felt like a disruption they could not fully ignore but also could not accept. Tyler fit their ideal with ease. I did not, and that difference shaped every moment of our lives. At church, people asked my mother about her golden son, and she beamed proudly. Yet, when they asked about me, she offered vague comments about how I kept to myself, or how she wished I were more outgoing like other girls. She rarely looked at me when she said these things, as if eye contact might give away more than she intended. I used to wonder if they noticed the look in her eyes when she turned toward me, the sharp evaluation hidden behind a polite smile. But no one questioned her narrative, and I did not yet know how to challenge it. Consistency is what convinces a community, and my parents were nothing if not consistent in the story they told. A hardworking father, a devoted mother, a promising son, a quiet daughter who simply needed to try harder. It was the kind of family people admired without realizing how many pieces had been glued together just to keep the facade intact. I think that is why no one ever suspected what lay beneath the surface until the night they threw me out and the cracks began to show in ways no one could ignore. I grew up learning how to make myself small in a house that seemed to shrink around me a little more each year, as if the walls themselves were trying to erase any trace that I had ever lived there. My earliest memories are not of birthday cakes or bedtime stories, but of the sharp crack of my father slamming a cabinet door and the tight, controlled voice my mother used whenever she said my name, like it was something she regretted choosing. I learned the rhythm of their anger before I learned multiplication, and I could predict the shift in my father's shoulders moments before he lashed out at furniture or shouted at whoever was closest. Sometimes the target was Tyler when he pushed too far, or smart-mouthed a little too boldly, but most of the time the blame somehow landed on me, even when I had been sitting quietly in another room with a book balanced on my knees. My father believed discipline meant volume and impact, and although he rarely struck me directly, he made sure I felt his presence in every slammed door, every thrown wrench, every time he towered over me demanding to know why I insisted on acting like a disappointment. When I cried, which was often as a young child, he barked the same phrase every time. "Stop crying, or I will give you a reason to cry," until the words burrowed into my mind so deeply that even years later I flinched whenever I felt tears start to form. My mother preferred quieter methods. She rarely yelled. Instead, she wielded silence like a blade, withholding affection, attention, and even basic acknowledgement whenever she felt I had embarrassed her or failed to meet a standard she had never clearly explained. If I forgot to bring in the mail, she would walk past me without speaking for hours. If I answered a question too softly in front of guests, she would sigh heavily and later lecture me about how my shyness reflected poorly on her. She perfected the art of making me feel invisible and somehow still too noticeable all at once. Tyler never had to navigate that emotional maze. To him, the house was a playground filled with praise and second chances. When he knocked over a lamp, my mother rushed to comfort him. When he mouthed off at our father, the punishment was mild, a reprimand softened with a joke about him being spirited. When I spilled the same lamp while dusting, I was scolded for being careless and for distracting everyone with my clumsy ways. Everything came in pairs. His success was celebrated. Mine was questioned, his mistakes, forgiven, mine used as examples of why I needed to improve. By the time I turned 10, the imbalance had become so normal that I barely registered it. I simply accepted the hierarchy and adapted my behavior to survive within it. I learned how to move quietly through rooms, how to anticipate the sound of anger brewing, how to shield myself with silence when words only made things worse. School felt like the only place where my existence carried any weight, though even there I was too cautious, too aware of the version of myself my parents expected me to be. Teachers complimented my intelligence, but the praise never reached home, because whenever they called my mother to discuss my progress, she brushed off my achievements as quirks or said she wished I would focus on more normal interests instead of burying myself in books. I remember one afternoon when Tyler and I were both asked to present projects at a school open house. Mine was a detailed research display complete with diagrams and neatly typed descriptions, while his was a poster board with some glued on magazine cutouts. My parents showed up late and left early without even looking at my table. They spent the entire time congratulating Tyler for his effort, and when I tried to show my father the system I had built to demonstrate a basic coding sequence, he waved me off, saying computers were just toys that distracted me from becoming a real adult. I felt invisible standing behind them, watching as they lifted Tyler onto their shoulders like a champion. Nights were the worst because our home seemed to shrink even further after sunset when my father's temper grew shorter and my mother's tolerance for anything out of place evaporated. Tyler could stay up watching television eating snacks, leaving crumbs everywhere without consequence. If I lingered in the hallway past 9, I was accused of eavesdropping or trying to stir up trouble. Sometimes my father shoved a chair or tossed a remote control across the room, not aiming directly at me, but close enough that I knew the message was meant for me. I slept lightly, always listening, always anticipating. Even moments that should have been tender were tainted by tension. Once, when I was 12, I tried to show my mother a poem I had written. She skimmed it without expression, handed it back, and said I should not waste time on things that would not help the family. A week later, Tyler scribbled an off-key rap performance and she framed it for his bedroom wall. I learned then that there were two kinds of children in the world, the celebrated ones and the tolerated ones, and I had been born firmly into the second category. The emotional whiplash became a constant companion hope, flickering on rare quiet days, only to be snuffed out when the next argument erupted. Whenever something good happened to me, a great compliment, a moment of quiet pride, it was either ignored, diminished, or dismissed as coincidence. On the rare occasions when I tried to speak up to defend myself, the backlash was swift. My father accused me of talking back, and my mother scolded me for making things difficult. Tyler told me no one wanted to hear my voice anyway, and sometimes I almost believed him. Growing up invisible was like living beneath one-way glass. I could see the world around me clearly, but no one ever seemed to see me back. They looked through me as though my presence made no difference, and I learned to fade into corners and hallways and empty rooms where my footsteps would not disturb the fragile peace. It was only years later after I left that I realized the invisibility they forced on me had given me something they never intended. It taught me how to observe quietly, how to study people, how to notice patterns, and how to survive in silence. A skill that would one day become the foundation of the technology that changed my life, and the weapon I used to free myself from the people who insisted I was nothing. But at the time, I was simply a girl trying to exist, without drawing attention in a house where attention always came with a cost. The first time I sat in front of a school computer, I felt something I had never felt at home. A strange, quiet sense of belonging that wrapped itself around me like a protective blanket. The monitor's soft glow felt gentler than any expression my parents had ever given me, and the keyboard beneath my fingers offered a kind of stability that did not shift or snap without warning. In that cramped school computer lab tucked between the library and the art room, I found refuge from the noise that ruled my house. Noise that did not always come in the form of shouting, but in the constant uncertainty of never knowing what version of my parents I would face each evening. I began staying after class under the pretense of needing extra study time, though the truth was I simply did not want to go home yet. The computer lab offered silence and structure, two things my house had never managed to hold on to for more than a few minutes at a time. At first, I explored the basics, typing practice programs, educational games, simple software tools, but within weeks I felt a pull toward understanding not just how to use a computer, but how it actually worked. I devoured every tutorial I could find, and when those ran out, I turned to online forums and videos that explained coding languages I had never heard of: Python, Java, HTML. It all fascinated me, not because I understood it right away, but because, unlike my parents, the computer made sense. It followed rules. It responded predictably. It never punished me for speaking or staying quiet or breathing in the wrong direction. One afternoon, I found a bug in the school's outdated network system completely by accident while trying to print a homework assignment. The printer refused to connect, so I began investigating why and discovered a small vulnerability in the network's access controls. I mentioned it to the computer lab supervisor, assuming he would be annoyed that I had somehow caused a problem, but instead he looked genuinely impressed. He asked me how I discovered it, and when I explained, he nodded thoughtfully and said someone with your mind should not ignore this path. I was 13 at this time, and it was the first moment in my life when an adult looked at me like I had value beyond chores or silence or unfulfilled expectations. His name was Mr. Porter, a soft-spoken man who taught technology elective classes, and he became the closest thing I had to a mentor, though neither of us ever officially said so. He offered me old programming books that the school planned to discard, and sometimes let me stay late in the lab while he graded papers or repaired equipment. He never asked about my family, and I never told him because the sanctuary he provided existed precisely because it was untouched by the chaos waiting at home. Coding felt like building a world where everything broken could be fixed if you looked closely enough and applied the right logic, something my real life had never allowed me to do. At home, even when I tried to repair relationships or avoid conflict, the result never matched the effort. But with code, every problem had a path to a solution, even if the path was long and complicated. I found comfort in that certainty. It was around this time that Tyler began mocking me more frequently, calling me a nerd, a ghost girl, a no social life loser. My parents echoed the sentiment in their own ways, telling me I spent too much time indulging in nonsense, or that I needed to be more like Tyler, who made friends so easily. They could not understand why I preferred the company of machines to the predictable hierarchy of family dynamics. They thought coding made me strange, but in reality, it made me strong. Still, I learned to hide my interest at home. I worked quietly at school during lunch or during the pockets of time between classes when teachers allowed students to use the computer lab for assignments. Every new concept I mastered felt like a secret brick added to a foundation I hoped might someday carry me somewhere far away from my house. When I was 15, I used my first real script to help a teacher recover a corrupted spreadsheet. She praised me in class and handed me extra credit, though she knew I had not asked for any reward. For the rest of that week, I held on to her words, tightly repeating them in my mind each night, when the yelling at home made me curl into myself and wish I could dissolve into the wallpaper. By 16, I had moved beyond school-level projects and started entering small online coding challenges. Most were just for fun, but a few offered minor cash prizes or gift cards, and winning even one felt monumental. I saved every dollar in a small envelope hidden inside the lining of my backpack. It was not much, but it represented freedom. Real freedom, not the kind my parents threatened me with whenever I displeased them. I spent weekends at the public library where the computers were faster and where no one questioned why I stayed until closing time. The librarians learned my name and sometimes left snacks at my station during long study sessions. Their kindness confused me at first. I was used to being ignored or criticized, and the sudden appearance of a granola bar or a warm, encouraging smile unsettled me more than it should have. But over time, I realized those small acts of kindness were shaping me just as much as the cruelty I endured at home had shaped me in other ways. Late one winter evening, as snow piled against the library windows, I ran my first successful security script, one that tested for vulnerabilities in a mock system provided by an online workshop. Watching the results load filled me with a rush I had never experienced. It felt like possibility, like standing on the edge of a world I had never been allowed to imagine for myself. I knew then with absolute certainty that coding was not just a hobby or an escape, it was a door, and if I kept pushing, eventually it would open wide enough for me to walk through. That hope became my fuel. It kept me steady during nights when arguments raged through the walls and days when my mother acted as though I were a stranger living in her home. Coding was the first place I ever felt capable, the first place where my voice, even if silent, held power. I did not know it yet, but that quiet refuge would become the very thing that allowed me to build a future. None of them could have predicted a future that would one day rewrite the balance of power they had used against me my entire life. I never set out to build a startup at 17, but life has a way of pushing you toward possibilities when everything around you feels like a dead end. By the time I reached my junior year, coding had become more than a refuge. It had become the one place where my mind felt free enough to imagine a world beyond the walls of our cramped Ohio house, where shouting drowned out thought and quiet was treated like defiance. I entered an online hackathon mostly out of curiosity and partly because the library computers were available until closing time. The challenge involved identifying weaknesses in a mock financial system and proposing a solution. I approached it the same way I approached every problem in my life, with caution logic and the hope that if I paid attention closely enough, something would eventually make sense. When I submitted my solution, I expected nothing. Winning was not even a distant possibility in my mind. So when I received an email 2 days later telling me I had placed in the top 5 and earned a small cash prize, my first reaction was disbelief. My second reaction was fear, because I knew if my parents found out they would demand the money and call it their due for allowing me to live under their roof. I kept the news quiet, deposited the prize into a separate account, and told no one, not even Mr. Porter. But the confidence it gave me shifted something inside. It whispered, "Maybe you are not the nothing they say you are." The next few months, I joined more competitions, some small, some obscure, some with participants far more advanced than I was. I lost more than I won, but each loss taught me something new, and each win, no matter how minor, felt like placing another stone in a path that only I could see. During one of these events, I met 2 people who would change the course of my life, even though we never met in person until much later. Their names were Victor and Elise, both a few years older, both already taking college-level computer science courses. We bonded quickly over shared jokes about messy open-source documentation and our mutual fascination with cybersecurity. What began as casual conversation soon became late-night discussions about problems we hoped to solve someday. Elise's brother had recently dealt with medical identity theft and the chaos it caused. Victor had an aunt who fell victim to insurance fraud and spent months fighting charges for services she never received. Stories like theirs were everywhere, and the 3 of us kept circling back to the same question: why do so many systems fail at detecting fraud before it harms people who cannot afford to be harmed? One night, while messaging on a shared channel, Elise wrote a sentence that froze the air around me. "We could build something that stops it. We. Not you, not I. We." Those 2 letters meant more to me than I could articulate because no one in my life had ever seen potential in me beyond chores, compliance, and silence. We spent weeks brainstorming possible approaches, most of them messy and unrealistic at first, but slowly our ideas sharpened. We decided to focus on building an AI-based detection system that could learn to identify anomalies in billing, medical records, and insurance claims long before those anomalies became financial disasters. We called our project Sentinel not because we considered ourselves saviors, but because the name captured what we hoped the technology would do: stand guard in places where humans could not always keep up. We built the prototype on borrowed time and borrowed machines. I coded in the library or the school lab, Elise coded between her college classes and work shifts, and Victor coded during nights when his dorm hall was finally quiet. I worked furiously whenever I could, weaving lines of logic between the unpredictable eruptions of my home life. More than once I coded with tears on my cheeks after a shouting match at home, but those nights taught me something useful. Emotion sharpened my focus. Instead of breaking me, it fueled the precision I poured into the system. After months of refining Sentinel, we submitted it to a startup incubator program for young developers not expecting much, but hopeful for feedback. Instead, we received an invitation to pitch. I remember reading the email in the school hallway, hands shaking, pulse racing, heart threatening to burst out of my ribs. For the first time in my life, I felt something close to pride in my work, pride in the idea that my contributions mattered. But I could not share that feeling with anyone at home. If my parents learned I was building something, they would either belittle it or attempt to control it. So I kept everything hidden, coding silently at night with the glow of my cheap laptop lighting the shadows of my bedroom. When we finally pitched Sentinel, the response was overwhelming. A small group of investors saw potential in what we built and offered seed funding enough to form a company, hire a legal advisor, and refine our prototype into a commercial product. We were 17 and 19 and had no idea how rare that opportunity was. All we knew was that someone believed in us. A few months later, a regional chain of hospitals contacted our team. They wanted to test Sentinel in their billing system, a trial that could lead to a full contract if successful. I worked harder than I had ever worked in my life, poring over data sets late into the night while muffling the sounds of my father arguing downstairs about bills and customers and why no one appreciated him. The trial succeeded. The hospitals found Sentinel cut fraud-related errors significantly and offered us a 5-year contract valued at $18 million. The payment would be issued annually based on milestones and system performance, meaning none of us were suddenly rich, but the contract alone placed us on a map my parents never knew existed. A startup attorney recommended structuring funds so that each of us received a modest stipend while most revenue-supported development vendors and operational expenses. Even so, I earned enough to build savings of my own real savings, enough to cover rent, food, education, and eventually more. The day the contract was finalized, I sat alone in the library with my laptop open to the signed digital document. I thought of the years I spent invisible of the slammed doors and silenced cries and the constant reminder that I would never amount to anything. And yet here I was, at 17, co-founder of a company no one in my family knew existed, holding proof that I was capable of building a life far beyond the limits they placed around me. I closed my laptop, swallowed the tremor in my throat, and walked home quietly through the cold Ohio evening, hiding a future so much larger than anything my parents could imagine. The night they expelled me from their house did not begin with shouting. It began with a small, quiet tension that sat in the air like a storm waiting for the right moment to break. My 18th birthday should have felt like a milestone, something tender, something hopeful. But instead it unfolded with the same brittle unease that had shaped every year of my life. The Hale family did not do warmth, we did tolerance, and even that wore thin whenever my father drank too quickly or my mother's smile began to tremble under the pressure of pretending everything was normal. Dinner had ended awkwardly, with relatives making small talk that skimmed the surface of politeness while avoiding the tension they had grown used to ignoring. My father's jaw twitched each time I spoke, and my mother's eyes flicked toward me in small, annoyed glances, as though my existence alone put her on edge. Tyler snickered through half the meal, making comments under his breath meant for me, but loud enough for our cousins to hear. I felt myself shrinking in the way I had learned to do so well, folding into the corners of my own body to avoid catching the spark that would ignite my father's anger. When the cake was brought out, I knew better than to expect anything personal. My name was spelled wrong in frosting. Something that would have devastated a younger version of me, but now only confirmed what I already knew: I was an afterthought, even on the day that marked my officially becoming an adult. After the guests left the house, quieted in a way that made the tension even louder, my father stood in the living room staring at the television without really watching it, while my mother wiped down already clean counters in the kitchen. Tyler disappeared upstairs, probably texting friends about how boring the night had been. I moved toward the staircase, planning to retreat into my room until the atmosphere settled, but my father called my name in a tone that stopped me cold. He did not ask me to sit. He did not look at me with softness. He simply turned and asked why I insisted on making everything so difficult. The question was vague, but in our house, vagueness was a weapon, a setup to justify whatever anger he wanted to unleash next. I said nothing because, in my experience, nothing was the safest answer. He accused me of being ungrateful, then of being distant, then of being dramatic for not smiling enough at dinner. My mother stepped in not to defend me, but to echo his complaints, adding that she was tired of walking on eggshells around my moods, even though I had barely spoken all night. Tyler came downstairs, drawn by the smell of conflict, like a moth to flame, leaning against the railing with a grin that made my stomach twist. I stayed still, hoping the moment would pass, but the silence only provoked my father further. He stepped closer, the alcohol on his breath sharp enough to make my eyes water, and demanded I explain why I could never be more like Tyler, who, according to him, knew how to make people proud. Something in me cracked then, not loudly, but in a small, quiet way that felt like a string snapping inside my chest. I said I was trying, which was the truth, but the truth was never enough for him. He took my answer as defiance, and in an instant his hand struck my cheek so fast I barely registered the movement before feeling the sting bloom across my skin. My head whipped to the side and the room tilted for a moment, but what I remember most is the stillness that followed the stunned silence that wrapped around all four of us like a heavy curtain. My mother froze. Tyler laughed softly, and my father, breathing hard, made a decision that had probably been building for years. He said it was time for me to stand on my own, that he was done supporting someone who gave nothing back, that 18 meant adulthood, and adulthood meant responsibility. But his words were not about responsibility. They were about rejection. He marched up the stairs, shoved open my bedroom door, and began throwing my things into an old suitcase with an urgency that had nothing to do with practicality. Books, clothes, notebooks, items he never cared about suddenly became objects he wanted out of the house as quickly as possible. My mother stood at the bottom of the stairs, watching without intervening, her face twisted in a mix of tension and relief, as if she believed letting me go would lighten the emotional weight of the household. When my father dragged the suitcase down the steps, it thudded with each bounce, echoing through the narrow hallway until it landed near my feet. He pointed toward the front door and told me to leave. When I hesitated, he repeated himself louder, saying I was an adult now, and adults who caused problems did not stay under his roof for free. I swallowed hard, tasted blood on my lip, and bent down to pick up the suitcase, feeling the cold metal of the zipper against my fingers. My mother's eyes flickered with something like guilt, but it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by the familiar rigidness she wore whenever she feared being judged by my father. She turned away. Tyler smirked. My father opened the door, letting a blast of cold air flood the foyer. Rain had begun to fall steady and unforgiving, and the wind whipped my hair into my face as I stepped outside. My father tossed my backpack after me and shouted that I would learn real life the hard way. Then he slammed the door, shutting out whatever fragile connection had existed between us. I stood on the porch, drenched, shivering with my cheeks still throbbing, and gripped the handle of my suitcase, fighting the urge to collapse into tears. But crying would not help, and weakness never protected me in that house. So I walked down the steps, letting the rain wash the heat from my face, and kept moving until the house faded into the darkness behind me. I reached the main road. My shoes soaked my jacket heavy and spotted a flickering street lamp that cast a small circle of light onto the pavement. That was where my legs finally gave out, and I sat down, breathing hard, fighting the rising panic. I had nowhere to go, no plan, and no family to turn to. But as I wiped the rain from my eyes, a different realization surfaced, one that steadied me even as everything else fell apart. They thought they had cast out a helpless girl with no future. They had no idea I was already part owner of a company with a signed 5-year contract worth $18 million. They had no idea I was leaving behind more than a house. I was leaving behind the last piece of their control. The morning after they threw me out, I woke in the small spare room of a classmate's cousin's apartment, still wearing the clothes that had clung to me in the rain the night before. My suitcase sat in the corner, sagging and waterlogged like a wounded animal, and the bruise on my cheek had darkened overnight into a deep, purplish reminder of the moment everything finally broke. I moved slowly through that morning, feeling strangely weightless, as if I had slipped into a version of my life where sound reached me a second too late and thoughts moved through thick fog. I kept touching my face, not because it hurt, but because I needed to remind myself that what happened had been real, that my parents had truly cast me out, that I no longer belonged to the household where I had spent 18 years learning how to disappear. Lena, the girl who had picked me up from the roadside after recognizing me on her way home, knocked gently on the door, holding a mug of instant coffee and offering a tight, worried smile. She did not ask for details because she had gone to school with me long enough to know the Hale family was not as picture-perfect as they pretended. She only said, "You can stay a few days until you figure things out." I thanked her and swallowed the lump in my throat because generosity always felt foreign to me. Those first few days passed in quiet motion. I searched for housing options on my laptop, scrolling through listings I could not afford yet, while my savings sat protected in accounts my parents did not know existed. I found a small room for rent in Chicago, barely larger than a closet, but clean, cheap, and far away from Ohio. It would take time to arrange the move, but at least it was a destination, a light in the distance. On the third day, my phone buzzed with a message from my Aunt Claire, one of the few relatives who had never fully participated in the Hale family's performance of unity. Her text said, Call me when you can. I stepped out onto the small balcony that overlooked the parking lot, wrapped my jacket tighter around myself, and dialed her number, expecting a brief conversation, maybe even mild scolding for leaving home so suddenly. Instead, her voice came heavy with hesitation when she answered. Madison, I was at church this morning. My stomach tightened because church in our town was not a place for spiritual reflection. It was a weekly stage where reputations were polished, judged, and reshaped. I asked what happened, though a part of me already dreaded the answer. She sighed, then said, Your mother has been telling everyone that you ran off. She said you dropped out of school, quit your job, and are couch surfing because you refused to take responsibility for your life. I closed my eyes as shock rippled through me, followed by something far colder. They had thrown me out, but apparently that was not enough. They needed a story that made sense to them, a story where I was the failure they always insisted I was. My aunt continued speaking quietly as though she feared someone might overhear, even though we were 2 states apart. She told the entire congregation that you refused to help around the house, that you argued all the time, that you left on your own because you wanted to be free of rules. She said you are practically homeless now. I leaned against the railing, pressing a hand to my forehead. Part of me wanted to laugh because nothing about the story surprised me. It was exactly the kind of narrative my mother liked to craft, carefully curated to make her appear like a patient, long-suffering parent, doing her best with a wayward child. Yet hearing it out loud knifed through whatever numbness I had been using to survive. I managed to whisper, I am not homeless. My aunt responded, I know. She paused, then added the part that broke me more than the lies themselves she told everyone. She hopes you learn your lesson and come back humbled, as if humiliation was their rightful tool to shape me, as if casting me into the rain had been a moral act. I felt the world tilt slightly as anger and sadness churned together beneath my skin. My aunt then hesitated before admitting something I had not expected. Some of the church ladies felt sorry for you. They said it was cruel to talk about your child that way, but your mother insisted she had done nothing wrong. I could almost see my mother in her favorite pew, hands folded, eyes downcast, performing grief like an art form as she lied about the daughter she had spent years undermining. I asked my aunt if my father had said anything. She inhaled sharply before answering, No. He just nodded and said, You need tough love. The phrase made my blood run cold. Tough love was a phrase people used to justify cruelty, to wrap abuse in soft ribbons so no one had to examine it too closely. After we hung up, I stayed on the balcony for a long time, staring down at the cars coming and going, each one disappearing somewhere I did not yet belong. The shame came first, hot and suffocating, because part of me always believed their words even when I fought against that belief. I wondered how many people in that congregation were now picturing me as a runaway, a failure, a burden cast out because I could not handle life. Then, something deeper settled under the shame, a quiet clarity, the same steady coldness I had felt in the moments after being thrown out. Their lies were predictable, but that predictability no longer held power over me. I knew the truth. I knew what I had built. I knew the contract worth $18 million that sat saved on my laptop, the one they never cared to ask about because they had never cared to know me at all. I left the balcony only when the sky turned dim gray and the air thickened with the promise of rain. Inside, I found the courage to open my laptop and begin the steps of securing my identity, freezing my credit, reporting the unauthorized accounts, and beginning the long process required to protect myself from the family who had turned my existence into a cautionary tale. Their lies were not the aftershock. The aftershock was the realization that I did not need to correct them. I only needed to move forward and let the truth unfold in its own time. I whispered to myself that day, they believe they cast out a problem. They have no idea they set me free. The email arrived on a quiet Thursday afternoon while I sat at the small kitchen table in Lena's cousin's apartment trying to gather the scattered pieces of a life I had never expected to build alone. I had been filling out rental applications for the room in Chicago, scrolling through lists of things I would need to buy on a budget I kept recalculating when a new notification slid into the corner of my screen. It came from a bank I had never opened an account with. The subject line said, Important notice regarding your recent credit line increase request. For a moment, I assumed it was spam. I almost deleted it. but something in the wording made me pause. I clicked and began reading. The message thanked me for submitting a request to increase the credit limit on an existing credit line that had been approved 2 years earlier in my name. My breath caught mid-inhale. I did not have a credit line. I had barely turned 16 2 years ago and had not even known how to apply for one. The email continued listing the account number, the approved amount, $28,000, and the address associated with it. My family's home address. A cold pressure clamped around my chest. I reread the email twice, hoping I had misunderstood, but the words stayed the same each time. Someone had used my social security number to open a credit line without my knowledge. I stood slowly from the chair, feeling the world tilt just a little, and walked onto the balcony so the crisp air could anchor me. My first instinct was fear, a sharp, immediate fear that something had gone terribly wrong and I was about to be held responsible for debt I had never created. But beneath the fear came another feeling, something older, something I had spent years trying to ignore suspicion. I dialed the customer service number on the email with trembling hands. After answering a series of security questions, the representative confirmed the account existed and had been opened using my SSN date of birth and forged digital signature. She asked if I wanted to verify recent activity, and my voice cracked when I said yes. The purchases were all from stores in my hometown. Car parts, home improvement supplies, bulk orders for the garage. My father's garage. My stomach twisted. I asked when the account had been opened. The representative replied, it showed as active for 2 years. Right around the time my father had expanded part of the garage and had suddenly boasted about finally catching up on bills. I thanked her, ended the call, and sank into the balcony chair, feeling my pulse thudding in my ears. For years, I wondered how my parents afforded renovations, how they paid for Tyler's sports equipment, how they kept up the image they clung to so desperately. Now, the answer sat glaring at me from the email. They had used me, literally used my identity. As the realization settled, a numbness spread through me, a slow heaviness that pressed against my ribs. I opened my laptop again and logged into my credit report. What I saw made my entire body go still. Not one unauthorized account. 3. The first was the $28,000 credit line. The second was a small personal loan taken out 18 months earlier. The third made my breath catch a mortgage refinancing for the house, with my name listed as a silent guarantor. I stared at the screen, unable to blink. Mortgage refinancing required physical or digital signatures, confirmation calls, verification steps. Yet somehow my name was on it. My signature, too. Someone had practiced. Or someone had access to documents that required only a simple scan to replicate my handwriting. My father handled every bill, every document, every envelope that entered the house. He always insisted on controlling anything financial. My mother rarely questioned him. Tyler certainly did not. It was him. I said the words out loud, even though the empty balcony offered no response. But once spoken, the truth ran straight through me. He had used my identity, my future, my credit to support the life they wanted while still calling me a burden. I needed more proof. My hands shook as I opened the mortgage documents attached to the report. The signature said Madison Hale, but the slant was wrong, the spacing off the way someone signs when they are copying a shape rather than forming their own name. I felt a strange, disconnected calm settle over me, the kind that comes not from peace, but from shock so sharp it silences everything else. I forwarded the files to myself, then created a secure folder labeled Identity Theft. At that moment, I did not feel anger, only a cold clarity. I had expected neglect. I had expected cruelty. But theft of this scale felt like a betrayal so calculated it hollowed out the remaining pieces of what I once thought family could mean. Lena knocked lightly on the balcony door, holding a bowl of soup. She paused when she saw my face. She asked if I was all right, and I tried to answer, but the words would not come. I handed her my laptop instead, pointing at the documents, because showing the truth was easier than saying it. Her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to anger on my behalf so quickly she barely managed to whisper, "Are you kidding me?" I shook my head. She stared at the screen again, then exhaled sharply and said, "You need a lawyer now." The word lawyer made something in me tighten. I was 18, barely beginning college applications, barely steady enough to imagine a future in Chicago, and yet here I was forced into legal territory because the people who raised me saw my existence as something they could spend. I closed the laptop and stood looking out over the parking lot where cars moved in slow loops. My family had not just thrown me out, they had planned it. They had set everything in motion long before the birthday, where they pretended the final explosion came from my behavior. They needed me gone before the bills collapsed. They needed a scapegoat. They needed the image of a daughter who ran away to cover the financial fallout of fraud they had committed under my name. The bruises from that night still ached, but this pain ran deeper, colder, sharper. I whispered to myself they wanted me invisible. They did not realize invisibility gave me room to see everything they hid. I returned inside, sat on the edge of the spare bed, and opened my laptop once more. Not to cry, not to break, but to do what I had always done when the world became too unstable. I began documenting everything: the dates, the signatures, the inconsistencies, the addresses, the transaction patterns. For the first time since leaving home, I no longer felt adrift. I felt focused. They had crossed a boundary that could never be uncrossed. And when the storm inside me finally began to settle, one truth rose above the rest with chilling certainty. They had stolen my identity, thinking I would never fight back. They had no idea who I had become. The next morning, I sat at the small kitchen table with a notebook open in front of me and the files spread across my laptop screen, trying to understand the scope of what had been done using my name. The shock had faded into something sharper, a deliberate, steady resolve that pushed me to take steps I never imagined taking at 18. I typed search after search into my browser, looking for attorneys specializing in identity theft and financial fraud, until I found a Chicago-based firm known for handling complex family-related cases. I hesitated only for a moment before dialing their number and explaining in a voice that shook more than I wanted it to that someone had used my Social Security number to open multiple accounts. The receptionist listened carefully, then scheduled an immediate consultation for that afternoon. When I arrived, the office felt overwhelming. Sleek glass walls framed by views of the city far bigger than the town I had come from. I sat across from an attorney named Daniel Haskins, a quiet, meticulous man with calm eyes and a manner that steadied my nerves. He asked me to walk him through everything, starting with the email and ending with the forged mortgage documents. I told the story in detail, pausing often when emotion clogged my throat, and each time he waited patiently, unswayed by the weight of what I revealed. When I told him my parents had thrown me out days earlier, something in his expression shifted. Not sympathy exactly, but recognition, the kind that suggested he had seen cases like mine far more often than I realized. After I finished, he folded his hands and said what I had suspected, but had not yet allowed myself to accept. "This will take months, not weeks." I nodded because I already knew the truth. Fixing the financial damage was not going to be fast or simple, and confronting the people who caused it would be even harder. He explained the steps clearly, as though building a staircase I had no choice but to climb. First, we needed to freeze my credit with all 3 major bureaus immediately to prevent any new accounts from being opened. Then we would file identity theft reports with the Federal Trade Commission and notify the IRS of a potential fraudulent situation because someone using my SSN could create tax complications. Next, we would dispute each unauthorized account following the formal procedures with every lender and request copies of the original application documents to prove forgery. He warned me that creditors often resisted at first, especially when accounts had existed for years. He also said something else, something that felt like a warning wrapped inside care. "Your family will likely be contacted during this process. They may try to manipulate the story. You need to stay firm." I felt my stomach twist, but I met his gaze and said I understand. Then he asked whether I wanted to pursue legal action directly against my parents. The question hung in the air, heavy, unsettling. I did not want revenge, not yet, not then. What I wanted was distance protection truth, a clean separation from the financial chains they had locked around me. I told him my goal was to free myself, not destroy them. He nodded but cautioned that the law sometimes required confrontation whether I wanted it or not. Then he added something that surprised me. There is another option. You are a co-founder of a registered company with significant projected revenue. You have the ability to intervene in this situation, not just as a victim, but as a controlling financial party if you choose. At first, I did not understand. He explained that if the mortgage and the garage loan were near default, which he suspected based on the dates we reviewed, the lenders might be willing to sell the debt to a qualified buyer, often at a reduced price. Companies buy debt all the time, especially debt tied to property or business assets. If my startup purchased the primary liens attached to the house and the garage, my parents would legally owe the debt to the entity I controlled. The realization hit me slowly, like fog clearing, to reveal a towering structure I had not seen before. Buying the debt did not mean punishing them. It meant protecting myself. It meant preventing the fallout of their actions from destroying my credit or sabotaging my career. It meant finally taking back power they had stolen piece by piece over years. He emphasized that the goal was not revenge, but control. By owning the liens, I could negotiate repayment set terms, require accountability, and ensure decisions were made in my best interest, not theirs. It was not personal. It was legal. It was strategic, and it was entirely within my rights. I sat there stunned by the possibility. Me, the girl who had been thrown into the rain with a suitcase days earlier, now had the chance to shape the outcome of a situation meant to break me. I took a slow breath, steadied my voice, and told him I want to move forward. His response was simple and resolute. Then we start today. The next few weeks blurred into a relentless series of steps, each one pulling me farther from the girl who used to shrink inside the Hale house and closer to the person I was becoming. I froze my credit-filed reports, documented every forged signature, collected statements, created secure digital backups of every communication, and began the painstaking process of disputing each account tied to my name. Meanwhile, Daniel contacted the lenders to request detailed histories of the mortgage and garage loan. What he found confirmed everything. Payments were behind. Final notices had been issued. Default was looming. My parents were drowning financially, but instead of admitting it, they had chosen to build a lifeboat out of my future, using my name as the wood they carved away. Daniel asked if I wanted him to contact them. I said no, not yet. Not until the strategy was ready. I spent nights in the small rented room in Chicago, hunched over my laptop, working on Sentinel refining code, meeting with Victor and Elise through late-night video calls, pretending my personal life was not collapsing behind the screen. Coding became my anchor again. The clear, logical steps soothed me when the legal maze overwhelmed my mind. During one of our late-night calls, I finally told them the truth about what was happening. They listened quietly, not with pity, but with the sharp focus of people who cared deeply. Elise was the first to speak. "You need to protect yourself, whatever it takes." Victor added, "We have your back no matter what." Their words settled in a place inside me that had been empty for so long I almost did not recognize the feeling that filled it. Support. Real support. Not conditional, not performative. Real. When the lenders finally responded to our inquiries, the picture became unmistakably clear. My parents had used my identity to secure loans they could not pay, and now those loans were on the edge of default. If my company stepped in, we could take control. So when Daniel asked me one last time if I wanted to proceed, buy the debt and formalize my legal position in the situation, my answer came without hesitation. Yes. It was not revenge. It was not spite. It was survival. And for the first time in my life, survival was on my terms, not theirs. The shift in power did not arrive with fireworks or confrontation or any dramatic explosion of truth. It arrived quietly through emails, contracts, and signatures exchanged between professionals who had no personal connection to the chaos that had shaped my life. While my parents went about their days believing they had successfully erased me from their narrative, I was in Chicago learning how to reclaim control, not by shouting, but by understanding the systems they never imagined I would one day use against their deception. Daniel explained that purchasing debt was a process built on patience and strategy, not emotion. He contacted the mortgage lender first, presenting our inquiry through my company's legal department, which gave the entire exchange an air of neutrality. The lender responded with cautious interest because the Hale mortgage had slipped deeper into delinquency than even I expected. The missed payments stretched back months, and the bank had already prepared documentation to initiate foreclosure proceedings if an acceptable solution did not appear soon. Daniel told me foreclosure would ruin my credit if my forged signature remained on the refinancing paperwork. That needed to be prevented at any cost. He also explained that lenders often preferred selling distressed debt to an interested buyer rather than spending months pursuing foreclosure. My startup represented a clean entity with verifiable assets and existing contracts, something the lender recognized immediately as a stabilizing force. We submitted a formal request to purchase the primary lien, and after lengthy review, the lender agreed to negotiate. The garage loan followed a similar pattern. The business had been struggling for years, but my father's pride kept him from acknowledging reality, even as debts stacked higher each season. The lender managing that loan welcomed our interest even more eagerly after learning that several payments had bounced. Each conversation took place through legal channels with none of the participants knowing I had any personal connection to the borrowers. It was clinical, impersonal, and astonishingly efficient. Daniel handled the calls, emails, and document transfers while I sat silently across from him in his office, watching a world of financial architecture unfold in ways I once thought belonged only to adults with carefully ironed shirts and immaculate confidence. But I belonged in that room. I felt it with each passing day as the possibility of reclaiming my identity grew stronger. During these weeks, my parents never contacted me, not once. I could not decide whether their silence hurt or helped, but the emptiness it left carved out space for a new version of myself to form. I poured energy into Sentinel coding before sunrise meeting with Victor and Elise after sunset, and spending the hours between preparing for the legal ramifications of everything my parents had done. Progress became my anchor. The girl who used to shrink at slammed doors was gone. The girl who built algorithms to detect deception now understood how to navigate a system designed to protect people exactly like her, someone who had been taken advantage of by those who should have been her guardians. 3 months passed before the final agreements were ready, and the lender sent over the official transfer documents. My hands shook only once when I signed my name. It was the first signature tied to my parents' debts that actually belonged to me. When the transfers were complete, Daniel looked up from the stack of papers and said with quiet finality, "It is done. The primary liens on the house and the garage now belong to your company. You are the controlling entity." The sentence washed over me in a slow wave, one that felt both surreal and deeply grounding. A girl cast out in the rain with a suitcase now held legal control over the very structures my parents relied on to sustain their lives. Yet the moment did not feel triumphant. It felt steady, clean, necessary. There were no fireworks in my chest, only a quiet dawning of something that had always felt unreachable: choice. I walked out of the office into the Chicago evening, the sky painted with streaks of orange and blue as if the city itself understood something monumental had shifted. For the first time in years, I breathed without feeling a weight pressing down on my ribs. But taking control was only the beginning. The next step required discretion. Daniel advised against immediate confrontation because the lender's notifications regarding the transfer needed time to process. Foreclosure warnings, final notices, and debt updates would arrive at my parents' home soon enough. They would know a change had occurred long before they knew who stood behind it. I spent that waiting period working relentlessly on Sentinel. The hospital system involved in our contract extended interest in broadening our pilot program, and Victor celebrated by sending us updates at 3 in the morning with paragraphs of excited rambling. Elise brought her usual strategic calm, balancing Victor's enthusiasm with curated to-do lists and manageable goals. Our startup became my sanctuary. The code I wrote late at night in my small rented room felt cleaner, sharper, more confident than ever before, as if taking back control of my identity had recalibrated something in my brain. Still, sometimes when notifications popped up on my phone, my heart raced with the reflexive fear that it was my father calling to demand something, or my mother texting to deliver guilt wrapped in scripture or social expectations. but their silence remained absolute. Eventually, the lenders finalized the transfer and began issuing formal warnings to the Hale address. Past due notices escalated to pre-foreclosure alerts, and suddenly my family faced consequences they never expected. I did not see their reactions. I did not ask about them. All I knew came through Daniel, who informed me that my father had left several confused voicemails for the bank demanding explanations, while my mother contacted neighbors insisting everything was a misunderstanding. But the louder they tried to deny reality, the more the truth tightened around them. They could not outrun paperwork. They could not intimidate legal documents. They could not manipulate a system that no longer relied on their version of events. Power had shifted smoothly, quietly into my hands without a single raised voice. The day Daniel forwarded the final confirmation that all liens were officially controlled by my company, I sat alone on my bed in the dim glow of my laptop screen, listening to the steady hum of city traffic outside. For 18 years, my parents defined every part of my existence: where I stood, who I was allowed to be, and how much space I was permitted to take. Now the balance had reversed, not with violence, but with precision. I whispered to myself, not out of pride, but out of truth. I own the ground they stand on. It was not vengeance. It was accountability, and accountability had never felt so calm. The notices started arriving at the Hale house slowly at first, then in a steady stream that no amount of denial could cover. Daniel had prepared me for this period, the uneasy window between the lenders finalizing the transfer of the liens and my parents realizing their financial world was no longer under their control. I imagined the first envelope sitting in their mailbox, bold printed warnings stamped across the front, while my mother sorted bills at the kitchen table, pretending not to see the words until ignoring them became impossible. I imagined my father ripping it open with the same impatience he used on everything that did not serve him immediately, and the flush rising in his neck as he read the contents, and realized the situation had shifted in ways he could not understand. For weeks, I received updates only through Daniel, who monitored communication from the lenders. He told me that my father called the mortgage company repeatedly, leaving angry voicemails demanding to know why the terms had changed and why notices were becoming more forceful. The garage lender reported similar calls filled with accusations and threats, and the same familiar desperation I had heard my entire childhood. Yet none of his demands produced answers because the system now moved according to the agreements I had quietly signed in an office far from Ohio. My parents were responding to shadows without knowing I was the one standing behind them. Meanwhile, my mother handled the crisis in the way she handled everything, by trying to maintain appearances. Neighbors caught glimpses of her sweeping the driveway in too perfect clothes, avoiding eye contact. Church acquaintances reported that she arrived late, services ended early, and whispered tense reassurances to anyone who asked how things were at home. She always said everything was fine, even as the cracks widened in a way that could not be hidden forever. Tyler did what Tyler always did. He ignored the problem by pretending it did not exist. From what I heard through distant acquaintances, he continued going out with friends, bragging about small victories and telling anyone who questioned him that his family had everything under control. It did not surprise me. That was the role he had been groomed for, to act as if the Hale world was unshakable, even when it was built on debt and denial. While their household destabilized, mine grew stronger. In Chicago, I attended meetings with Victor and Elise to plan the expansion of Sentinel and finalize technical updates for our next review with the hospital network. I spent long nights sitting cross-legged on my bed with my laptop humming softly, while the city lights glittered through the blinds. The more I focused, the clearer everything became. Not just the code, but the necessity of seeing the legal process through to its final step. The confrontation my parents never expected, and I had once feared. Daniel advised that once the lenders formalized our control over the liens, we should request a meeting with the borrowers to discuss next steps. The borrowers meant my parents. Discussing next steps meant presenting the terms I was now entitled to enforce. He suggested a meeting at the lender's partner bank in Ohio, a neutral setting with enough authority to make the situation feel official but not hostile. I listened carefully to every detail of the plan. At first, the idea of sitting across from my parents after everything that had unfolded made something inside me tighten. I was not afraid of them anymore. Fear had burned out of me months ago, replaced by a steadiness I barely recognized. What unsettled me was the knowledge that facing them meant seeing the people who had shaped my childhood through the lens of the person I had become. It meant stepping back into the past while standing firmly in the present. It meant proving to myself that I no longer needed to shrink. Daniel drafted the formal meeting notice and sent it to the Hale House with language that referenced loan restructuring repayment obligations and lien holder authority. There was no mention of my name, no hint that I was involved. Everything looked like a standard legal procedure. When the notice reached them, my father called the number listed demanding to speak with whoever was responsible. The representative explained calmly that a meeting was mandatory before any additional extensions or considerations could be made. My father cursed loudly enough that even Daniel winced while relaying the story. My mother also called, leaving a voice message where she sounded strained polite, but strained, and asked whether the situation could be handled without an in-person meeting. The answer was no. 2 days later, Daniel received confirmation. They would attend. I sat in his office as he reviewed the details of the upcoming meeting, his voice steady and practical, as if we were planning a routine business negotiation rather than the confrontation that would dismantle the story my parents built about themselves. He asked if I wanted to bring anyone. I said no. This was mine. Chicago felt like a different universe from Ohio, but when I boarded the bus heading back toward the place where everything began, I felt strangely calm, not comfortable, not eager, just calm, the kind of calm that comes when you know you are walking into a moment that will not define you, but will instead confirm how far you have come since the last time you stood in front of the people who tried to contain you. I arrived a day early and stayed in a small hotel outside town where no one would recognize me. I spent the evening reviewing documents one last time, though I already knew them by memory, and watching the lights of passing trucks reflect across the walls. For the first time, I did not feel like an outsider visiting my hometown. I felt like a witness arriving to observe the final unraveling of something that had been poisoned long before I was born. The morning of the meeting, I dressed carefully not to impress them, but to remind myself that I belonged in the room. My palms trembled only once when I collected the folder of documents, but the tremor faded by the time I reached the lobby of the regional bank where we would meet. Daniel was already there, speaking quietly with an administrative assistant. When he saw me, he nodded with the kind of reassurance that required no extra words. A staff member led us to a private conference room with glass walls and clean, polished lines, and I took a seat beside Daniel facing the door. I could hear footsteps in the hallway, muffled voices, then the door handle clicked. My mother entered first, followed by my father, then Tyler trailing behind with the same careless swagger he always wore. They looked smaller than I remembered, worn somehow by the weight of the situation they had tried to hide. My father scanned the room, expecting a bank representative or a manager to greet him. Instead, he saw me, his face drained. My mother stopped mid-step, a hand flying to her chest. Tyler muttered what the hell under his breath. None of them knew yet why I was there. But they were about to. And for the first time in my life, I was ready. My father was the first to speak, but the words came out uneven, as if the air in the room had rearranged itself the moment he saw me sitting there. "What is she doing here?" he demanded, glancing sharply at the empty seat where he expected a bank representative to appear. My mother's eyes darted between me and Daniel, her breath thin and shaky, while Tyler slouched in the doorway, trying to mask his confusion with irritation. Daniel closed the folder in front of him with deliberate calm and said, "Thank you for coming, Mr. and Mrs. Hale. Before we begin, please take your seats." My father bristled at the instruction, but sat anyway, dropping heavily into the chair across from me as if the weight of his pride clung to his shoulders. My mother sat beside him, though she kept her purse clutched tightly in her hands like a shield. Tyler remained standing until my father snapped "sit down," and he slumped into the chair with an exaggerated sigh. The silence that settled in the room pulsed with tension, a thick, uneasy quiet that seemed to press against all of us. I felt my pulse in my fingertips, but my voice stayed steady when I finally said hello. My mother flinched. My father stared at me with narrowed eyes, then shifted his glare to Daniel. He asked sharply, "Where is the lender?" Daniel met his stare without blinking. "I am not here on behalf of the lender." My father frowned, confused, then impatient. Then why are you here? Who are you representing? Daniel opened the folder again, slid a document across the table, and said a single sentence that snapped the room in half. Ms. Hale is the acquiring party. For a moment, no one moved. My mother's hand rose instinctively to her mouth as if trying to hold in a gasp. Tyler blinked once, then again, his brows pulling together as he tried to process the words. My father stared at the document as though it had personally betrayed him. Then his face reddened. "What do you mean, acquiring party?" he demanded. His tone trembled with disbelief, not understanding, yet refusing to believe. Daniel answered calmly, "The primary liens attached to your home and to the garage business have been purchased by Ms. Hale's company. By law, she now controls the debt and all decisions related to it." The color drained from my father's face, leaving him gray and rigid. "You bought our mortgage?" he said, each word dragged out like he could not piece the sentence together. "And our loan. Why would you do that?" I held his gaze and answered because my name was on both. His jaw tightened. "That was a misunderstanding. Your mother explained everything." I nodded slowly. "Yes, she explained it to the church. She told them I ran away because I was irresponsible, unemployed, and ashamed. She did not mention that the refinancing included my forged signature or that the credit line used to fund your garage expansion was opened with my social security number." My mother shook her head quickly, tears forming in her eyes. "We thought you would understand. We needed help." "You should have been willing to contribute." "Forging my identity is not help," I said. "It is not family. It is fraud." Tyler scoffed under his breath. "You are being dramatic. Dad did what he had to do. Just let it go." I turned to him. "Let it go. You are defending identity theft." He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, eyes cold. "You have money. Why do you even care? If you wanted to help, you could have." I felt something inside me harden. The truth was clear. They never wanted my success. They wanted access to it. Daniel placed another set of documents on the table. These outline the terms moving forward. The Hale home and garage are now under Ms. Hale's authority. You have two options. 1. You may sell the property, which will fully resolve the outstanding debt and remove the liens. 2. Ms. Hale may assume ownership and you may remain as tenants under a structured rental agreement. My father's voice cracked. We would have to pay rent in our own home. "It is not your home anymore," I said quietly. "Not legally. Not financially. Not ethically." My mother burst into tears, pressing her palms against her face. She cried not from remorse, but from the fear of losing the image she had polished for decades. My father, however, slammed his hand on the table loud enough to make the glass walls tremble. "You ungrateful brat!" he shouted. "You ruined us!" I remained still. "No, I prevented you from ruining me. You put my future in jeopardy. You signed my name to debts you could not pay. You lied to everyone about who I am while using my identity to keep your lifestyle intact." My father opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. The truth had cornered him. Tyler's voice rose mocking and defensive. "You always thought you were better than us. Now you think you can come back and control everything." I turned to him with a calm that frightened even me. I did not come back to control anything. I came to take responsibility for what was done in my name because none of you ever intended to. The room went silent again, but this silence felt different. Heavy. Final. My mother reached across the table, her fingers trembling. "We are your family. How can you do this to us?" I leaned forward, keeping my voice soft but unshakably clear. "You taught me exactly how. The night you threw me out, you said I was not your problem anymore. You said I should learn life the hard way. You said I was useless. But the truth is, you never knew me at all." My father's shoulders sagged. The fight drained out of him, leaving exhaustion in its place. Daniel slid the final page across the table. "You have 7 days to decide which option you choose. Sell or rent. After that, actions will proceed according to state law." They rose slowly from their seats, moving like people who had aged years in the span of minutes. When they reached the doorway, my mother glanced back, eyes rimmed red, and whispered, "You could have helped us." I met her gaze. "I did, just not the way you wanted." The door closed behind them, leaving the room silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. I exhaled for the first time in what felt like years, realizing that the confrontation I had feared my entire life had come and gone without destroying me. Instead, it had revealed something I had never expected to find: strength. Not loud strength, not angry strength. Quiet, unshakable strength. Consequences rarely arrive as a single dramatic blow. They come in waves, steady, cold, inevitable, and each one strips away a layer of denial until the truth stands bare. 3 days after the showdown, Daniel forwarded me the first formal notice from the mortgage lender confirming receipt of our meeting summary and acknowledgement that the borrowers were now aware of the lien holder's rights. I imagined my father reading it at the kitchen table, jaw-tightening pulse, rising, forcing himself to believe there was still a loophole he could squeeze through. But there was none. Their 7-day window passed without a response. That automatically triggered the next phase. The house would move toward a forced sale unless they initiated the rental agreement. Neither option was pleasant for them. For once in their lives, they had to choose between responsibility and pride won until responsibility crushed it. On the 9th day, my mother called Daniel, sobbing so hard her words blurred together. She said that selling the house was impossible, that she could not bear the humiliation, that she did not understand how things had escalated to this point. She never asked how I felt when she watched me walk into a storm with a swollen cheek on my 18th birthday. She never mentioned throwing my suitcase into the rain or telling the church I was a disgrace. Her grief was only for the life she was losing, not the daughter she had already lost. Daniel responded with professional courtesy and no leniency. A week after that, the official sale process began. The house was listed quietly through the lender's designated agent. It was strange seeing photos of it online, clean, bright, edited to look inviting, when I remembered the slamming doors, the stained carpet on the stairs, the dent in the drywall from when my father missed the remote he threw at me. People often say homes hold memories. I wondered what this one held for them. For me, it held a childhood I survived rather than lived. The offers came in faster than I expected. The market in our area had improved, and families looking for starter homes saw potential in the little 2-story place with the red front door. By the end of week 3, an offer met the lender's requirements, and my parents were notified that their move-out date had been scheduled. That was when the second wave of consequences hit. Tyler was forced to get a job. It seemed unthinkable to him. He had spent years coasted on the illusion that his minor contributions to the garage made him indispensable. But the garage defaulted on its loan 2 weeks after the house listing went public. Without emergency funding, repairs could not be made. Without repairs, customers stopped coming. Without customers, income evaporated. The business was seized by the bank and shuttered within days. Tyler panicked. He applied everywhere but was unprepared for adult life workers' comp paperwork, scheduling, accountability. For the first time, he heard the word no and had to accept it. Word spread quietly through town about the Hale family's unraveling. Church members who once repeated my mother's carefully curated stories began whispering different ones that did not paint me as the problem. People asked questions my mother could not answer. Why had their debts been so high? Why had the garage failed? Why had their daughter been absent from every event for months? And in the vacant space where their lives used to live, truth seeped in. I did not relish any of it. I watched from Chicago, receiving updates the way one watches a storm from behind thick glass, detached, aware, but no longer endangered. Meanwhile, my life moved forward with clarity I had never known. Sentinel secured its next phase of funding, and our pilot program in the hospital network flagged fraudulent activity that saved them close to $500,000 in 1 quarter. The team celebrated late into the night, but I excused myself early, stepping outside into the cool air as the city hummed around me. I realized I no longer trembled at unexpected sounds. I no longer flinched when someone raised their voice in surprise. Healing is not loud. It is not cinematic. It is subtle, steady like a tide, reshaping the shoreline. I attended therapy twice a week, processing memories I had shoved into corners for years. There were moments when I cried without warning and moments when I felt nothing at all. Both were progress, my therapist said. Both meant I was finally letting myself feel instead of surviving on reflex. One evening, I received a message from a distant cousin, someone I barely remembered. It said simply, "I heard what happened. I am sorry nobody protected you. You deserved better." I stared at it for a long time. Those 3 sentences meant more than any apology my parents could have offered. The house sold officially on a Thursday. The final statement came to me through Daniel, showing the debts cleared in full, my name legally separated from every fraudulent obligation. My parents moved into a small rental 2 towns over, a place far humbler than the image they once clung to. My mother stopped attending church regularly. My father stopped boasting about the garage. Tyler stopped posting photos with captions about success. They did not reach out. Not once. That silence used to ache. Now, it felt like peace. I did not realize how much of my life had been shaped by survival until the day I woke up and felt something unfamiliar in my chest, quiet. Not silence born of fear or exhaustion, but genuine quiet, the kind that settles when nothing is clawing at you anymore. Chicago mornings had always felt brisk and indifferent, yet suddenly they felt like possibility. Sunlight pooled through the blinds of my apartment in soft lines instead of harsh stripes. The radiator rattled like it always did, but the sound no longer startled me. Healing came in fragments, not in a triumphant rush, but in moments so small I almost missed them. The first time I walked down a hallway and did not tense at the echo of footsteps behind me. The first time I heard someone raise their voice across the office and did not instinctively brace for impact. The first time I looked in the mirror and did not see the girl who flinched when doors slammed. Therapy helped, but so did time, and so did the steady rhythm of building something that belonged entirely to me. Sentinel grew faster than any of us predicted. Our system successfully flagged a network intrusion attempt in one of the hospitals, and the administrators praised our responsiveness. Suddenly, potential clients who had once brushed us aside were requesting meetings. Venture firms that used to laugh at teenage founders were asking when we planned our next funding round. Victor joked that we were becoming adults in the tech world. Elise said we were finally getting the respect we worked for. I nodded and smiled, but deep down, I felt something more profound than pride. I felt anchored. Not to them, but to myself. At 20, Madison from Ohio had finally stepped into a life untouched by her parents' definition of her. I furnished my apartment slowly, choosing pieces not because they were practical or cheap, but because they sparked a sense of calm. A soft blue rug that reminded me of lake water. A round lamp that cast warm, diffused light. A plant I watered every morning with a kind of reverence because it symbolized a life that needed care, not fear. On weekends, I walked through neighborhoods I had never explored before, stopping at coffee shops where nobody knew my name. I read books without worrying someone would burst into the room demanding something. I learned to cook simple meals and burned a few until I found my rhythm. One afternoon, as I chopped vegetables, the knife slipped from my hand when a neighbor slammed their door in the hallway. My heart lurched into my throat. The old instinct snapped awake so fast it shocked me. But instead of spiraling, I pressed my palms flat on the counter, breathed deeply, and said aloud, "You are safe." It felt strange but powerful. Therapy taught me that the body remembers long after the mind moves on. Every time a memory surfaced sharp and uninvited, I learned to let it pass, like a train rushing by instead of boarding it. I did not want to relive Ohio. I wanted to understand it and bury it in the right soil. A few months into my new routine, Daniel sent me a final update confirming that all matters connected to the Hale debts were officially closed. There would be no further obligations, no trailing complications. It was done. Completely. I stared at the email for almost 5 minutes, letting the reality sink in. Closure rarely looks like fireworks. Sometimes it looks like a single sentence quietly rewriting the weight you have carried for years. I thought I might feel triumphant, but instead, I felt light. Not joyous, just unburdened. That evening, I sat on my balcony overlooking the street below, listening to the hum of passing cars and distant voices from the sidewalk. People laughed somewhere a block away. A siren wailed faintly, then disappeared. Life was ordinary, and for the first time, ordinary felt good. Even healing has setbacks. There were nights I woke drenched in sweat, heart pounding after dreaming of my father's shout or my mother's cold silence. Nights when I questioned if I had done the right thing, even though I knew I had. But every morning that followed those nights proved that doubt was temporary, while peace was slowly rooting itself inside me. One morning, Elise and I met early at a cafe to plan our next product update. She looked at me for a long moment before saying, "You seem different, lighter, like you finally exhaled." I smiled because she was right. I had. I finally allowed myself to imagine a future not shaped by fear or obligation. A future where I could build without waiting for someone to tear it down. When Sentinel received approval to pilot our software in 3 additional states, I celebrated by myself in my apartment. Not because I felt alone, but because I finally knew how to be with myself without feeling like something was missing. That was healing too. One night, after a long day, I walked through the city as snow began to fall. The flakes melted on my sleeves and hair, and the streetlights turned everything gold. I realized that I had made a life far from where I started, a life built not on running away, but on choosing better. Better people, better opportunities, better boundaries. I did not need a dramatic moment to declare my freedom. I was living it quietly, steadily, in every breath that no longer trembled. And for the first time, I allowed myself to believe something radical. I deserved this life. I deserved peace. I deserved to stay whole. If I regret anything, if there is a part of me that wishes I had handled things differently or shown more mercy, or tried one more time to make my parents see me as a human being rather than a tool they could use or a problem they could silence. I think about that question often, not because I doubt myself, but because healing requires honesty, and honesty demands that I look directly at the life I came from without flinching. The truth is, I do not regret protecting myself. I do not regret drawing a line after years of erasure fear and emotional bruises that lasted long after the physical ones faded. I do not regret refusing to carry the debt they created with my stolen identity and my stolen childhood. What I do regret is all the years I spent believing their version of me. Weak, difficult, ungrateful, invisible. I wish I could go back to that 17-year-old girl sitting in the library long after closing time, coding in the glow of an old monitor because the rhythm of keys under her fingers was the only place she felt real. I would tell her, "You are not the problem. You are the possibility." I would tell her that one day she would build a company using the very skills they mocked. I would tell her she would stand in a room across from her abusers and they would no longer have the power to shrink her. I would tell her she would choose herself and that choosing herself would not make her cruel. It would make her free. People also ask if I feel guilty that they lost the house. And the answer is complicated but honest. I do not feel guilty for the consequences of their choices. Accountability is not cruelty. Boundaries are not betrayal. They built a life on borrowed money and borrowed identities. They pushed me out into the rain on my 18th birthday and told the world I was a failure while using my social security number to finance their comfort. They believed they would never face repercussions because for years they never did. I did, and I survived. Taking back my name was not revenge. It was reclamation, a quiet reclaiming of the person I always was beneath their disbelief. A lot of people who hear my story tell me they wish they had my strength. But the truth is, I did not start strong. I started scared and small and bruised. Strength did not show up one day wearing armor. It grew in the cracks. It grew in every moment I kept going when quitting would have been easier. It grew in every reminder from people like Daniel, Elise, and Victor, who treated me not like a burden, but like a peer. And most of all, it grew in the silence after the door finally slammed behind me and the world outside opened into something bigger than fear. If you are listening to this and any part of it feels familiar, please hear me when I say this next part. Blood does not make family. Safety does. Effort does. Respect does. Anyone who weaponizes your loyalty is not protecting you. They are controlling you. Anyone who punishes your boundaries is not loving you. They are feeding off you. You are allowed to walk away. You are allowed to protect yourself even if the people you are protecting yourself from share your last name. You are allowed to choose peace without apologizing for it. Healing is not linear, and it is not about forgetting. It is about remembering without crumbling and living without asking for permission. I do not know if my parents ever tell the truth about what happened. I do not know if they sit in their small rental 2 towns over, replaying the moment the balance of power shifted in a conference room they walked into, believing they were untouchable. I do not know if Tyler ever understands the privilege he lived inside while calling me dramatic. None of that matters now. The story they wrote about me no longer governs my life. I am writing my own now, and every day I add another sentence filled with choice, rather than fear. So, this is my final message to you, whoever you are, wherever you are listening from. If you have ever had to leave the family that raised you in order to save the person you are becoming, you are not alone. If you are standing at the edge of a decision that feels impossible, trust that peace on the other side is real. If you are rebuilding your life from the ground up, know that brick by brick, you are creating something no one can take from you. You deserve a life shaped by safety, not survival. You deserve joy that does not tremble. You deserve a future written by your own hand. And now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to walk away to protect yourself? Have you ever been told you were the problem only to discover you were the one holding everything together? Have you ever found strength in places you did not know existed? Tell me your story. And before you go, let me know where you are listening from, because voices carry farther when we share them, and healing becomes lighter when we do it together.